Hi, I'm Drew Jenkins, and this is my author discussion for W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was born February 23rd, 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. W.E.B. Du Bois' home city of Great Barrington, Massachusetts was known as a low segregation area. I even read one source that said there was no segregation at all in some parts. And when he went to school, he was one of the very few African Americans, so it was very surprising that he got a scholarship to go to university. And W.E.B. Du Bois first went to university in Fisk University, and later he ended up going from Fisk and got a scholarship to Harvard University. And after doing his undergrad at Harvard and a year in masters, he then went to work on his PhD studies at University of Berlin. And after getting his doctorate, he was announced to be the first African American doctorate in the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois also did some pretty amazing things in his life. He was the founder and leader of the Niagara Group, and this was a group that was a civil rights activist group, and they were very, very passionate about everything they did, but eventually the group kind of broke apart, and remnants of that group inspired to make the NAACP, which is the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. And W.E.B. Du Bois was a very powerful position within the NAACP, and he ended up staying with this group for nearly about 40 years. Some other awards in his life, throughout his whole life. In 1920, he earned the Spingarn Medal, and then in 1959, he earned the Lenin Peace Prize. Another great thing that W.E.B. Du Bois was, he was an author, and as an author, he didn't just simply do one thing. He wrote poetry, he wrote books, he wrote speeches. And some of the poetry that he wrote was The Souls of the Black Folk and Litany of Atlanta. And Souls of the Black Folk was something that was very popular. And I think the reason it was so popular was because it was one of the first of its kind of an affirmation of black pride. And some of the themes that people took away from this poem was something about race, and then something how race can end up being a good thing or a bad thing, but you should still have pride over whatever race you are. And some of the images that it brought up was that of defiance and that of taking action when you have ideas you want to express, because African Americans were often denied the expression of their ideas. And the Litany of Atlanta was written in response to violence against blacks in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was a poem, a very long poem. It was about 44 lines, and it was W.E.B. Du Bois talking to God, or asking God why such cruel things were happening to the African American people. He asked gods for help, and he asked gods to end black suffering, and it's in the end it turns away from asking God to help when he's just really asking God for change, because that's a big thing that we'll end up talking about later, that W.E.B. Du Bois' philosophy is change, and change in the country, and change in his culture. W.E.B. Du Bois wasn't just an author, he was also a politician in a way. He had a very firm philosophy about change and making progress for the African American community, and this was seen as inspiration for his writings, as we talked about earlier, as, Litany of Atlanta. He also wrote many speeches about politics, and a few of these speeches challenged another rival African American activist, which was Booker T. Washington, and they had a very tough rivalry. And so a little something about Booker T. Washington is he was very different. He had a different philosophy and a different culture than W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, as I said earlier, grew up in a very low segregated town in the New England area of Massachusetts. However, Booker T. Washington was born into slavery, and so that gives him a completely different perspective on things, since he has his problems that are directly involved with slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois never had to personally experience slavery, so his whole philosophy was a bit warped in Booker T. Washington's eyes. Booker T. Washington, his philosophy was about being an ideal citizen and making something of yourself as a positive member in society, because if you do that, then the white people are going to accept you, and if you abide by the white people's laws, then they'll also begin to accept you. And although Booker T. Washington was very popular in the black community and also in the white community, that philosophy that he has, that idea, was often critiqued and challenged by W.E.B. Du Bois because they're very different. W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about making change in your society and defying the rules to make something new and make progress, while Booker T. Washington is very, if we stay stagnant and abide by the laws and abide by the morals of a good citizen, change is bound to come because people are going to realize that we can be positive in this society. By the end of W.E.B. Du Bois' life, he ended up being very political, and he ended up being very left-winged, which caused him to be fired, or disputed to be fired, from his teaching position at the University of Atlanta in 1944, and it was said that his radical views later caused him to be forced to resign out of the NAACP in 1948. And given these two events, over the next 12 years of his life, he faced a lot of scrutiny and a lot of critics from other African American activists and other activists around the country as a whole. And so in 1968, W.E.B. Du Bois actually renounced his American citizenship and moved to Ghana and formed a citizenship there. However, he didn't last very long, as he ended up dying in he ended up dying August 27th in 1963. I'd like to thank you for watching. This is going to be my references here on this last slide. These are going to be the websites that I followed in the book. Thank you. This is Drew Jenkins for the author discussion of W.E.B. Du Bois.